Chapter 5 of Warning. What is the daily of the 1290 days of Daniel chapter 12 verse 11? And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, shall be 1290 days. The prophet Daniel was told to shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. Daniel chapter 12 verse 4. There are no 44 verses in chapter 12. One of the words which was shut up and could not be understood was the daily. Not until the time of the end, the last generation, was Daniel chapter 12 to be understood, and not until end time was the daily in the context of Daniel 12 to be unsealed. Some parts of Daniel have always been understood. Some aspects of prophecy have always been at least partially comprehended. The European reformers recognized the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 to be the papal Rome, and this brought about the separation between Rome and Protestantism. By 1798, when the Pope was taken captive, Protestants recognized the 1260-year days of Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 to have begun in 538 and ended in 1798. The book of Daniel was further unsealed by the Great Advent movement, which began the emphasis of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14 and the 2300-year day prophecy. After 1844, the Advent pioneers opened further Daniel chapter 8 and 9 in an understanding of the investigative judgment. Looking at history from a 6,000-year perspective, it was correct that the Advent pioneers did live in the time of the end, and great light shone on them regarding the meaning of Daniel chapter 7 and chapters 8 and 9. However, they did not live in the end time of the last generation, which would finally bring Daniel 12 and the daily into focus. When the time shall come in the providence of God for the world to be tested upon the truth for that time, minds will be exercised by His Spirit to search the Scriptures, even with fasting and prayer, until link after link is searched out and united in a perfect chain. They, the precedent generations, had the Bible, as we have, but the time for the unfolding of special truth in relation to the closing scene of the earth's history is during the last generation that shall live upon the earth. Second Testimony, pages 692-693. The daily could be likened to a time lock on a bank vault, which will not open until the time occurs for which it was set. Prophecy is history written in advance, the unrolling of the scroll, and it cannot be pried open before it is about to happen. Only then, as God permits, can the prophetic expositor open the door of the prophetic vault to discover the treasure therein. The daily has been so securely locked away until the end of time that the efforts to discern its meaning have ended in uncertainty and frustration. For more than 2,000 years, great men of the Word have wrestled with this enigma. For example, the Jews believed the daily was the daily ritual and sacrificial system, and that it was taken away when pagans who destroyed their temple and stopped the daily sacrifices. Number 2, some early Christians believed the daily had been Christ's ministry here on earth, which was taken away at the crucifixion. Number 3, later, after the apostasy of the 3rd and 4th centuries, some Christians believed the daily referred to the true gospel, which had been taken away by the apostasy. Number 4, European reformers continue to understand the daily to refer to Christ's priesthood and heavenly ministry as presented in the true gospel, the knowledge of which had been taken away from the common people by papal Rome. Number 5, Papal Rome declared the daily to be the daily Mass and the Eucharist, which had been taken away by the European reformers in the Protestant separation from Rome. Number 6, The pioneers of Adventism understood the daily to be paganism or pagan Rome, whose seat and authority was taken away by papal Rome. Other early Adventists differed, believing that the daily referred to Christ's continual ministry, which had been taken away by papal reign from the minds of the people. Number 7. Contemporary prophetic expositors vary. Some believe that the daily refers to Christ's heavenly ministry, which will be taken away at the close of probation. Others reason that the daily is the perpetual Sabbath, the freedom to worship on the true Sabbath, taken away by Sunday laws. Still others have taught that the daily is the everlasting covenant, which will be taken away from the wicked at the close of probation. It is possible to find serious objections to every one of the above listed views. All of these views cannot be correct. Much could be classed as conjecture or at best the wisdom of man, which usually leads to darkness and confusion. It is unprofitable in regard to the daily to seek enlightenment from the mass of past and current confusion. We need to clear our minds and begin with a clean slate. Therefore, it is time to put away all preconceived ideas and to approach the daily of the book of Daniel in the chapter that we are studying right now, 12 verse 11, with a clear mind. The study of this present subject should be accomplished with a scholarly approach and with utmost care to observe hermeneutic principles as follows. Before we read the different principles, we want to go back to this note here. The various views of the past can be traced in the 4 volumes of Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers by Eli Froom. In this book, there is a chart on the daily in which the various great expositors are listed with their views on the subject. Additional information is available on the chart. Now, let's continue with the hermeneutic principles. The original language must be consulted according to primitive root meaning, not secondary meanings, nor attributive use. Number 2, the spirit of prophecy, admonition, and guidance should be observed. Number 3, the Isaiah principle of biblical cross-reference should be followed. Contextual, number 4, meaning of the chapter and the book must be observed. Number 5, the theme of the great controversy as brought to view in the book of Daniel must be considered. Number 6, prophetic exposition is a science in which one concept is built upon another, just like the principle we find in Isaiah chapter 28 verses 9 to 13. Precept must be upon precept, and it must be reasoned true. Number 7, the conclusion must fit appropriately into the subject of the timeline in regard to all aspects of final crisis and deliverance in harmony with other end-time prophecies of Revelation. If the study is correct, the reader should be able to explain without reservation that it is so clear it is amazing that we have not seen it before. This chapter gives answer to the following questions. What is the daily sacrifice? What is the daily tamid? What is the context of the daily? What is the daily continuum? What is the daily cycle continuum? What is the daily scepter? How was the daily taken away? How will the daily be taken away? What were the Advent pioneers? What did the prophet say about the daily? Part 1. What is the daily sacrifice? In most Bibles, in the book of Daniel, the word daily is attached to the word sacrifice as follows. Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, the daily sacrifice was taken away. Chapter 8:12, given him against the daily sacrifice. Chapter 8 verse 13, vision concerning the daily sacrifice. Chapter 11:31, shall take away the daily sacrifice. Daniel chapter 12 verse 11, daily sacrifice shall be taken away. In most King James versions and others, the word sacrifice is in italics. This means that it was not in the original language in which the book was written. The word sacrifice was supplied by the translators. Why did they do this? Because of the fact that the word daily is not a noun but an adjective. This creates a dilemma. The subject is missing. When the noun or subject of the discussion is missing, the question arises, what is the daily? The translator of the Bible, the King James Version, were aware of this missing noun and tried to the best of their knowledge to supply it, so they inserted the word sacrifice. It seemed somehow to be appropriate, especially as the Jew had understood it to refer to the temple sacrifices, and the Christian understood it to refer to the sacrifice or ministry of Christ. The Lord revealed through his prophet to the remnant people that this word sacrifice was incorrect and would lead God's people into error, darkness, and confusion. Early writing, pages 74-75, then I saw, in relation to the daily of Daniel chapter 8, verse 12, that the word sacrifice was supplied by man wisdom and does not belong to the text. Darkness and confusion have followed. The first thing the Bible student should do is to take a pen or a pencil and put a line through the word sacrifice in all 5 references as given above in his own Bible and put that idea completely out of his mind. We must understand that the daily has nothing to do with the typical ceremonial sacrificial system of burnt offerings of the earthly sanctuary as translated in the RSV. Neither has it anything to do with Christ's antitypical sacrifice on Calvary. All arguments which leads back to the sanctuary daily sacrifices and ritual or to Christ's sacrifice are incorrect. There are some who assume that the daily refers to Christ's priestly role and heavenly ministry. They explain that his ministry is much greater than his sacrifice. However, the fact is that almost the entire book of Hebrews is an argument to prove that Christ's total ministry as high priest and mediator of the new covenant is valid only by virtue of his incarnation and sacrifice on Calvary. Paul explains that all priests officiated with blood and that Christ has entered into heaven and is appearing for us with the sacrifice of his own blood. It is impossible to separate the heavenly ministry of Christ from his sacrifice, for it is the central act of the entire process of the atonement. Therefore, if the prophet stated clearly that the word sacrifice does not belong in the text, and the concept of sacrifice is not to be associated with the daily of Daniel, then there is strong objection to the idea that the daily refers to Christ's continual heavenly ministry. It is probably this line of reasoning, among others, which caused the Advent pioneer to look in another direction for the meaning of the daily in the book of Daniel. Notice this to see the appendix now on the wider ministry of Christ, not the daily of Daniel. So Christ's ministry is not the answer for the daily. So what is the daily tamid? The definition in Hebrew 85:48 of the daily means from an unused root to stretch as infinite extension, continuance, but used only attributively as continual, daily, even more perpetual. And this is from the Strong Exhaustive Concordance, Hebrew and Chaldees Dictionary, page 125. The word daily has been translated from the original language, tamid. This root is apparently no longer in use, but it originally had the meaning to stretch, an indefinite extension, a continuum. It is most unfortunate that it has been translated daily in Daniel, giving the reader the idea of something that occurs over and over again. It is this troublesome problem which has caused so many over the years to immediately associate it with the sanctuary service, with all the daily rituals of the ceremonial law, and especially with the daily or continual sacrifice there offered. This is entirely misleading. The root word tamid has to do with a continuum stretching out in an indefinite length, as from eternity to eternity, everlasting to everlasting, rather than the idea of something happening over and over as in a continual repetition. If we can now shift our thinking from something which happens over and over again to an understanding of the daily as continuum, stretching out with unlimited boundaries at either end, we shall be able to make headway in discovering the true identity of this end time concept as used in Daniel chapter 12. What is the context of the daily? When the noun is missing and only the adjective is available, which denotes the subject to be something which stretches out with indefinite extension, it is necessary to go beyond linguistic study to examine the context and theme. The prophetic expositor must examine the nature and purpose of the entire book of Daniel, the theme of the 12th chapter of Daniel, the concept presented in the 11th verse of Daniel 12, and the major theme of the entire Bible. First, the entire book of Daniel should be examined for its theme. From chapter 1 to 12, it focuses on the rise and fall of nations. It traces the scepter of power from Babylon to Medo-Persia, to Greece, to Rome, to the nation of Europe, from pagan Rome to papal Rome, and at last to the Great Stone Kingdom. One prophetic expositor said it nicely. The story of the seer of Patmos, Elder Haskell, page 289. Daniel wrote the history of the world from the standpoint of nations. He deals primarily with nations. A contemporary prophetic expositor in a discussion in the book of Daniel as a literary chiasm has stated in this way: the literary structure conveys a theological trust. That theological trust revolves around the question of who has dominion. That is a word that occurs frequently in chapter 7. Thus, it is a key theological term for understanding the vision. In chapter 7, each of the earthly kingdom rise and fall, receiving dominion for a time and passing it on to a successor. These successive dominions are described in the first half of the chiasm. At the apex of the chiasm stands the scene of judgment in the heavenly court. As a result of the decision of this heavenly tribunal, there comes in the destruction of all earthly powers as it is described in the second half of the chiasm. The pattern then is one of dominion finally taken away. The vision then concludes with the giving of final, eternal, and all-inclusive dominion to the Son of Man. Praise ye the Lord. This is found in the Symposium on Daniel, and it was also taken from Volume 2, pages 176, 177 of the Committee Series. The action of the book of Daniel is that which transfer the scepter of power from nation to nation until in the last chapter it is grasped by the abomination that make desolate in an unprecedented establishment of a one world system of control and persecutes the people of God until their final deliverance at the voice of God. It is this concept which links Daniel 12:11 with Revelation 13. The establishment of the beast in which he holds the scepter of power in the end time is described as follows. And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast, and power, the scepter of power, was given unto him to continue to reign 42 months. And power, the scepter of power, was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nation. Revelation 13:3-7. The book of Daniel focuses on the scepter of power as it is transferred from nation to nation. Verse 11 of chapter 12 provide exactly the same focus. It simply says, "And from the time that the daily or scepter of power shall be taken away from all kindreds and tongues and nation, and given to the papacy, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up or be established, there shall be 1,290 days." Daniel 12 verse 11. The context of the book and the verse are synonymous. The context of the book and the verse are synonymous. As we look now at the next question, what is the daily tamid or continuum? Let the reader remember that the tamid or daily is a primitive root meaning to stretch of indefinite extension. So the daily or the tamid from everlasting to everlasting. What is the context of the tamid daily in regard to the whole Bible? If in the book of Daniel the theme is that of the transfer of the scepter of power from nation to nation until it is finally restored to the saints and to Christ in God's new kingdom, is that not also the theme of the whole Bible, the entire plan of salvation, the idea of Eden restored? This is a question that we are asking here, the context of the Tamid, and then looking at the book of Daniel is not, it brings us to question, is that not also the theme of the whole Bible, the entire plan of salvation, the idea of Eden restored? The scepter of power originated in the eternal throne of God. It was delegated to Adam when he was given dominion, the scepter of power over this earth. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion." Dominion is the scepter of power. It's the daily. It's the continuum. At the fall of man, the devil usurped that dominion or scepter of power and has delegated it as far as God's permits to those nations whom he seeks to control and by whom he harasses and attempts to destroy the people of God. Immediately after Noah's flood, Nimrod grasped the scepter of power and built Babel, which developed into the kingdom of Babylon, with its counterfeit system of worship of the sun. It was the fully developed empire of Babylon in which Daniel lived. Therefore, the book of Daniel begins and traces the scepter of power from nation to nation until, at the end of time, it will revert back to Christ's throne kingdom. Like a great circle, this scepter of power is from everlasting to everlasting. The scepter of power is the great tamid, or the daily continuum, which stretches from eternity to eternity. It is taken away only in the sense that it passes from one hand to the next. In this sense, it is the tamid continuum that is so obvious that Daniel neglected to name it. It is the subject not only of the book of Daniel, but of the entire Bible. The following illustration makes clear the cycle of the scepter of power as traced in Scripture and specifically in the book of Daniel. And this cycle is brought to its concluding action and final climax in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. As we look now at the cycle of the scepter of power, the tamid or continuum or daily, we see here, as mentioned, God here on his throne gave the scepter to Adam to have dominion over the earth and to subdue it. He was to be the steward of the earth, the caregiver. Then it was usurped by Satan. Satan took it away from him in Genesis 3. And now we know that Nimrod and the Tower of Babel points to the worship of the planets and the sun. So this is the establishment of the first false religion right after this is after the flood, of course. Before the flood, they had already changed all this, but here is after the flood where we have again an attempt to reestablish a new world order. This is not the first time. Then the scepter was passed on to Babylon, Medo-Persia, Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, Gracia, Alexander the Great, Rome, the Caesars, which is the pagan Rome. Then he passed it on to the papal Rome, supremacy number 1, 538 AD to 1798 AD in Europe. Then it passed on to the hand of Napoleon in 1798, which took the Pope prisoner. And now at the very end, we're going to have the kings that are giving the scepter back to who they have served, which is the Pope, the papacy. This is actually the supremacy of the Pope that we have not seen yet. We have seen the first one under the Dark Ages, but not the second one. And then the scepter will return to his right owner, with Christ sitting on his throne. So this is a brief but comprehensive plan of action of what we can follow the devil with. And this is a very, very important study. So between the first supremacy in Europe and the second supremacy all over the world, this is where we are today.